Hello and welcome back. You're watching Parry This. Today we will be covering another topic from the First Crusade. Today's topic is the Fatimids of Egypt, the other of the two primary enemies of Christendom in the First Crusade. We covered the Seljuks last time, and if you want to know more about them, I suggest checking out that video as well. Unlike that one, we have to start a little bit earlier than their involvement in the First Crusade to explain who this faction actually was. So let's dive on in and see what these guys were up to. So we'll start with a little bit of background information. The Fāṭimid Dynasty was a political and religious dynasty that dominated an empire in North Africa and subsequently in the Middle East from 909 AD to 1171, and tried unsuccessfully to oust the Ābbāsid caliphs as the leader of the Islamic world. It took its name from Fāṭimah, the daughter of the Prophet Muḥammad, from whom the Fatimids claimed descent. Before the Fatimids, there had been other rulers in North Africa and Egypt who had succeeded in making themselves virtually independent of the Ābbāsid caliphs in Baghdad, but they had been Muslims of the Sunnī branch of Islam, willing to recognize the token suzerainty of the caliph as head of the Islamic community. The Fatimids, however, were the heads of a rival religious movement, which is known as the Shīʿī or Shiite branch of Islam, and they were dedicated to the overthrow of the existing religious and political order in all of Islam. Unlike their predecessors, they refused to offer even nominal recognition to the Ābbāsid caliphs, who they rejected as usurpers. They themselves, as imāms or Muslim spiritual leaders, descendants of the Prophet through his daughter Fāṭimah and his kinsman ʿAlī, were in the eyes of their followers the rightful caliphs, both by descent and by divine choice, the custodians of the true faith and the legitimate heads of the universal Islamic state and community. Their purpose was not to establish another regional sovereignty, but to supersede the Ābbāsids and to found a new caliphate in their place. So let's get talking about that caliphate. The Fāṭimid Caliphate was a regime at once imperial and revolutionary. At home, the caliph was a sovereign, governing the vast empire and seeking to expand it by normal military and political means. Its heart was Egypt. Its provinces at its peak included North Africa, Sicily, the Red Sea coast of Africa, Syria, Palestine, the Yemen, and the Hejaz, with the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Control of these was of immense value to the Muslim ruler, conferring great religious prestige and enabling him to exploit the annual pilgrimage to his advantage. The mission was elaborately and secretly organized under the supreme direction of the chief missionary in Cairo. In the Fāṭimid state, the mission became in effect a third branch of the government. Together with the traditional military and bureaucratic establishments, it thus approximated to something otherwise lacking in the medieval Islamic world, an institutionalized state church. The primary tasks of the mission were the formulation and dissemination of Ismāʿīlī doctrine. Ismāʿīlī theologies supplied the arguments by which the Fāṭimids denied the Ābbāsid claim to the caliphate and asserted their own, and was thus a powerful weapon in their armory. First in Tunisia and then in Egypt, a series of distinguished theologians wrote what became the classical formulations of Ismāʿīlī doctrine. The Fatimids, who founded great libraries and colleges, whose functions were to train missionaries to go out into the field and to provide further instruction for the converts sent to Cairo for this purpose. Linked with these actions was a great commercial expansion and an economic policy aimed at developing the Red Sea trade between Asia and the Near East, to the detriment of the alternative route through the Persian Gulf, which was controlled by Sunni powers. In the course of this effort, the Fatimids extended their own rule down both shores of the Red Sea, established their supremacy in Yemen, and sent missionaries to Eastern Arabia, to Central Asia, and to India. So as you can tell by what I just discussed, the Fatimids were in their own crusade at this time against all the Sunni Muslims, primarily the Seljuks, who at this time had gained most of the power over this region. And actually, interestingly enough, the Fatimids actually captured the city of Jerusalem from the Seljuks shortly after the Crusaders would take Antioch. So by the time the Crusaders got to Jerusalem, it was actually not in control of the Seljuks, but actually the Fatimids, but only for about 3 months. And that brings us up to the Siege of Jerusalem, which took place from June 7th to July 15th, 1099. The climax of the First Crusade, the successful siege, saw the Crusaders take Jerusalem from the Fāṭimid Caliphate and laid the foundations for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Fāṭimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, prepared the city for the siege as he heard about the arrival of the Crusaders. He prepared an elite troop of 400 Egyptian cavalrymen and had expelled all the Eastern Christians from the city due to fear of betrayal from them. Since in the siege of Antioch, an Armenian man named Feroz helped Crusaders enter the city by opening the gates. To make the situations worse for the Crusaders, ad-Duwala poisoned or buried all the water wells and cut down all the trees outside Jerusalem. On the 7th of June, 1099, the Crusaders reached outside the fortifications of Jerusalem, which had been recaptured from the Seljuks by the Fatimids only the year before. The city was guarded by a defense wall 4 kilometers long, 3 meters thick, and 15 meters high. There were 5 major gates, each guarded by a pair of towers. Now the Fatimids prepared to fight on 2 fronts. After taking their position, the Crusaders launched their first attack on the 13th of June. The main problem was that they didn't have access to wood for siege equipment, but then Tancred had a vision. He found a stack of wood hidden in a cave. They used it to make a ladder. A knight named Rainbold scaled the ladder to gain foothold on the wall, but was unsuccessful. Since this assault was a failure, the Crusaders retreated and did not make any attempt until they got their tools and equipment. The Crusaders faced a lot more difficulties due to the lack of water and scorching heat of Palestine, and also a shortage of food. And by the end of June, there was news that a Fāṭimid army was marching north from Egypt. Due to the mounting pressure, Crusaders decided to act quickly. On the 14th of July, 1099, the Crusaders launched their attack. Godfrey and his allies were positioned towards the northern wall of Jerusalem. Their priority was to break through the outer curtain walls of Jerusalem. By the end of the day, they penetrated the first line of defense. On the south, Raymond of Toulouse's forces were met with ferocious resistance by the Fāṭimids. On the 15th of July, the assault recommenced in the northern front. Godfrey and his allies gained success, and the Crusader Ludolf of Tournai was the first to mount the wall. The Franks quickly gained the foothold in the wall, and the city's defenses collapsed. Waves of panic shook the Fāṭimids. The next significant event in the First Crusade concerning the Fāṭimids of Egypt was the Battle of Ascalon, which took place on the 12th of August, 1099, shortly after the capture of Jerusalem, and is often considered the last action of the First Crusade. The Crusader army, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, defeated and drove off a Fāṭimid army, securing the safety of Jerusalem for a time. The Fāṭimids were led by Vizier al-Afdal Shahanshah, who commanded perhaps as many as 20,000 troops, though historians have estimated upwards of 200,000, but of course those claims are ridiculous. His army consisted of Seljuk Turks, Arabs, Persians, Armenians, Kurds, and Ethiopians. He was intending to besiege the Crusaders in Jerusalem, although he had brought no siege machinery with him. He did, however, have a fleet, also assembling in the port of Ascalon. The precise number of Crusaders is unknown, but the number given by Raymond of Aiguillers is 1,200 knights and 9,000 infantries. The highest estimate is around 20,000 men, but this is surely impossible at this stage of the crusade. Al-Afdal camped in the plain of Majdal in the valley outside Ascalon, preparing to continue on to Jerusalem and besiege the Crusaders there, apparently unaware that the Crusaders had already left to meet him. On August 11th, the Crusaders found oxen, sheep, camels, and goats, gathered there to feed the Fāṭimid camp, grazing outside the city. According to captives taken by Tancred in a skirmish near Ramla, the animals were there to encourage the Crusaders to disperse and pillage the land, making it easier for the Fāṭimids to attack. However, Al-Afdal did not yet know the Crusaders were in the area, and was apparently not expecting them. In any case, these animals marched with them the next morning, exaggerating the appearance of their army. On the morning of the 12th, Crusader scouts reported the location of the Fāṭimid camp, and the army marched towards it. During the march, the Crusaders had been organized into 9 divisions. Godfrey led the left wing, Raymond the right, and Tancred, Eustace, Robert of Normandy, and Gaston IV of Béarn made up the center. They were further divided into 2 smaller divisions, and a division of foot soldiers marched ahead of each. This arrangement was also used as the line of battle outside Ascalon, which the center of the army between the Jerusalem and Jaffa gates, the right aligned with the Mediterranean coast and the left facing the Jaffa Gate. According to most accounts, both from Crusader sources and Muslim sources, the Fāṭimids were caught unprepared and the battle was short, but Albert of Aix states that the battle went on for some time with a fairly well-prepared Egyptian army. The 2 main lines of battle fought each other with arrows, until they were close enough to fight hand-to-hand with spears and other weapons. The Ethiopians attacked the center of the Crusader line, and the Fāṭimid vanguard was able to outflank the Crusaders and surround their rear guard, until Godfrey arrived to rescue them. Despite his numerical superiority, Al-Afdal's army was hardly as strong or dangerous as the Seljuk armies that the Crusaders had already encountered, so they were seriously outclassed. The battle seems to have been over before the Fāṭimid heavy cavalry was prepared to join it. Al-Afdal and his panicked troops fled back to the safety of the heavily fortified city. Raymond chased some of them into the sea, others climbed trees and were killed with arrows, while others were crushed in their retreat back into the gates of Ascalon. Al-Afdal left behind his camp and its treasures, which were captured by Robert and Tancred. Crusader losses are unknown, but the Egyptians lost around 10,000 infantry and 2,700 residents of Ascalon, including militia, were killed. The Crusaders spent the night in the abandoned camp, preparing for another attack. But in the morning, they learned that the Fāṭimids were retreating to Egypt. Al-Afdal fled by ship. They took as much plunder as they could, including the standard and Al-Afdal's personal tent, and burned the rest. The Battle of Ascalon marks the end of the Fāṭimids as a major threat to Christian forces in the Middle East, although not the end of battles with the Fāṭimids, which would continue off and on until 1153, when the Crusaders would finally capture and wrest control of Ascalon from the Fāṭimids once and for all. Several reasons may be adduced for the failure of the Fāṭimid bid for Islamic leadership. One was their adoption and retention of religious doctrine that was ultimately unacceptable to the Sunni majority. Fāṭimid Ismāʿīlism as a theology was remote from the central consensus of Islam, and with the Sunni revival of the 11th and 12th century, its rejection became certain. The coming of the Crusaders indirectly sealed its fate, for in the great 12th century contest between Islam and Christendom, there was no room for dissension on the Muslim side. I know that many novice historians often get confused about who did what in the Crusades, and what all went on, and most overlook the fact that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had to contend with not one, but two regional superpowers in the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids of Egypt. In the end, it is likely that the most substantial legacy of the First Crusade is the lasting dominance of Sunni Islam in the Muslim world, as it was in large part due to the First Crusade that the Fatimids were not able to continue their expansion of their caliphate, with their ultimate goal of dominating and converting all Muslims to their Shiite sect. Well, that's all I have to say about the Fatimids of Egypt. I hope this video cleared up any confusion out there, and in conjunction with my video covering the Seljuk Turks, fully explains the Muslim side of the First Crusade. I hope you found this video to be informational and entertaining. But in any case, thanks for watching, and have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.